The dark secret that haunted Gene Kelly until death. Introduction. Behind the infectious, smile and gravity-defying dance moves of Hollywood's golden boy lay a shadow that would follow Gene Kelly to his grave. The man who made Singing in the Rain an eternal masterpiece, who revolutionized dance on screen and captured hearts worldwide, carried with him a burden so heavy that even his closest friends never knew its full weight. Tonight, we peel back the carefully constructed facade of one of cinema's most beloved figures to reveal the dark secret that haunted Gene Kelly until his final breath, a truth that would shatter everything you thought you knew about the King of Dance. Section 1. The golden facade. The perfect Hollywood dream. Gene Kelly stood atop the world in the 1950s, his name synonymous with artistic brilliance and infectious joy to audiences worldwide. He was the embodiment of the American dream, a working-class kid from Pittsburgh who danced his way to immortality. His smile could light up the darkest theater, his movements defied the very laws of physics, and his films promised that even in the bleakest moments, there was always a reason to dance. But little did the world know that behind those sparkling eyes and that million-dollar grin, Gene Kelly was fighting a war with himself that would rage for decades. The man who taught America to find happiness in puddles and lampposts was drowning in a private torment that grew more suffocating with each passing year of fame. Hollywood, in the 1940s and 50s, was a machine that manufactured dreams. But it was also a prison that demanded perfection. Gene Kelly had become its crown jewel, but the weight of that crown was crushing him. Every morning he would wake up in his Beverly Hills mansion, look in the mirror, and prepare to become the man the world expected him to be, knowing full well that this performance was slowly killing the real Gene Kelly inside. The studio system owned him, body and soul. Every dance step was choreographed, not just for the camera, but for public consumption. Every interview was scripted, every appearance calculated. Gene Kelly, the person, was disappearing, replaced by Gene Kelly, the product. And somewhere in that transformation, a secret took root, one so dangerous that its revelation could have destroyed not just his career, but everything he held dear. As he perfected his craft and climbed higher up Hollywood's golden ladder, the distance between his public persona and his private reality grew into an unbridgeable chasm. The more beloved he became, the more isolated he felt. The more he smiled for the cameras, the deeper his internal anguish grew. The stage was set for a tragedy that would play out in silence, hidden behind the very spotlight that made him a star. Section 2. Shadows of Pittsburgh. Childhood that shaped a secret long before Gene Kelly became Hollywood royalty. He was Eugene Curran Kelly, a scrappy kid from the steel gray streets of Pittsburgh's East Liberty neighborhood. The third of 5 children born to Irish Catholic parents, Gene grew up in a world where men worked with their hands, not their feet. His father, James Kelly, was a phonograph salesman who struggled to keep the family afloat during the Great Depression. His mother, Harriet, was a woman of fierce determination who saw something special in her boy, something that both thrilled and terrified her. The secret that would haunt Gene Kelly for life began to take shape in those formidable Pittsburgh years. In a neighborhood where being different could mean being destroyed, young Gene found himself drawn to movement, to rhythm, to the kind of expression that made other boys sneer and whisper behind his back. Dance was considered feminine, frivolous, unmanly, but for Gene, it was as essential as breathing. His mother enrolled him in dance classes. Despite the family's financial struggles and the neighborhood's disapproval, she told everyone it was to help with his coordination for sports, but the truth ran deeper. Harriet Kelly recognized that her son possessed something extraordinary, a gift that transcended gender roles and social expectations. But she also understood that this gift came with a price that would have to be paid in silence and shame. The other children were merciless. They called him names that cut deep into his developing sense of self. They questioned his masculinity, his worth, his right to exist as he was. Young Gene learned to fight with his fists as much as his feet, defending not just his reputation but his very identity. Yet even as he bloodied noses and proved his toughness, the whispers followed him home, seeping into his consciousness like poison. These childhood experiences carved a wound in Gene's psyche that would never fully heal. He learned that to be accepted, he had to be twice as masculine as everyone else. He had to prove that his artistry didn't diminish his manhood, a lesson that would shape every relationship, every career decision, and every private moment for the rest of his life. The boy who would become a symbol of joy was learning that his greatest talent was also his deepest source of shame. Section 3. The dance teacher's dilemma. A young man's dangerous awakening. By his late teens, Gene Kelly had established himself as one of Pittsburgh's most promising dance instructors. The Kelly family had opened their own studio, and young Gene found himself in a position of authority and influence that was both exhilarating and dangerous. Teaching dance to the sons and daughters of Pittsburgh's elite gave him a taste of power, but it also exposed him to temptations and situations that would plant the seeds of his lifelong torment. It was during these years as a dance instructor that Gene Kelly first confronted the darker aspects of his own nature, aspects that society had taught him to fear and suppress. The intimate nature of dance instruction, the close physical contact, the emotional vulnerability required to truly teach movement, all of these elements created a charged atmosphere that young Gene found increasingly difficult to navigate. Truth that no biography would ever dare print was that Gene Kelly struggled with attractions and impulses that terrified him. In 1930s Pittsburgh, such feelings were not just socially unacceptable, they were criminal, sinful, and could destroy a man's life without mercy. Gene found himself drawn to certain students, caught in moments of connection that went beyond the purely professional, and each time it happened, the weight of his secret grew heavier. He began to develop elaborate mental defenses, throwing himself into increasingly masculine pursuits to prove his heterosexuality to himself and others. He took up boxing, played baseball with religious fervor, and began cultivating an image of aggressive heterosexual prowess that would follow him throughout his career. But the more he protested, the louder his inner voice became, reminding him of the truth he could never speak. The dance studio became both his sanctuary and his prison. Here, he could express himself through movement, lose himself in the pure joy of artistic creation. But it was also where his demons lived, where every day brought new tests of his self-control and new reasons to hate the person he feared he might be. The young man who would soon conquer Hollywood was already learning to live a double life, one that would require constant vigilance, endless performance, and the gradual suffocation of his authentic self. Section 4. Broadway Dreams and Hidden Nightmares, the Price of Ambition. When Gene Kelly arrived in New York City in the late 1930s, he carried with him not just dreams of Broadway stardom, but a secret so heavy it threatened to crush those dreams before they could take flight. The Great White Way was a place where talent could flourish. But it was also a world where weakness was exploited and secrets were currency in the hands of those who discovered them. Gene's breakthrough role in Pal Joey should have been pure triumph, playing the charismatic but morally ambiguous Joey Evans. He found a character that allowed him to channel his own internal contradictions into art. But success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought danger. Broadway was a tight-knit community where gossip traveled faster than applause, and Gene Kelly quickly learned that his rising star made him a target for those who might seek to exploit his vulnerabilities. The theatrical world of the 1940s operated under an unspoken code of silence about certain subjects. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. Careers could be destroyed by whispers, lives ruined by rumors. Gene watched other talented performers disappear overnight, their names erased from marquees and their futures obliterated by allegations that were never proven but always believed. The message was clear: conform or perish. During these Broadway years, Gene Kelly began to perfect the art of misdirection that would define his entire career. He threw himself into highly publicized romances, ensuring that photographers captured him with beautiful women at all the right events. He cultivated friendships with the most masculine figures in the industry, boxers and athletes who could vouch for his heterosexual credentials. Every public appearance was calculated, every relationship strategic. But the effort required to maintain this facade was exhausting. Gene found himself living in constant fear of exposure, analyzing every gesture, every glance, every word for potential misinterpretation. The spontaneity that made his dancing so magical was being slowly strangled by the need for control. The young man who had come to Broadway to find freedom was instead discovering that success meant an even more elaborate prison, one built from his own paranoia and society's unforgiving expectations. The secret was no longer just about his own nature, it had become about survival itself. Section 5. Hollywood's Golden Cage, the studio system's perfect weapon. When MGM came calling in 1942, Gene Kelly thought he was escaping to paradise. The contract offered money, fame, and the chance to revolutionize dance on screen. What he didn't realize was that he was walking into a system that would weaponize his secret against him, turning his greatest fear into the studio's most powerful tool of control. Louis B. Mayer and the MGM executives were masters of manipulation, who understood that a star's vulnerabilities were often more valuable than their talents. They didn't need to explicitly know Gene's secret, they could sense its presence in his desperate need to please. His willingness to do whatever was required to maintain his image. The studio system fed on such fears, using them to keep even their biggest stars in line. Gene Kelly's early Hollywood years were marked by an almost manic dedication to proving his masculinity through his work. He insisted on performing his own stunts, no matter how dangerous. He pushed for increasingly athletic and physically demanding dance sequences that would leave him battered and bruised but unquestionably male in the public eye. Every performance became a form of penance, every success a temporary reprieve from his own self-doubt. The irony was devastating. The more successful Gene Kelly became, the more he had to lose, and therefore, the more carefully he had to guard. His secret, his rising star status, made him increasingly paranoid about exposure. He began to see threats everywhere in the glances of crew members, in the questions of journalists, in the casual comments of colleagues. The man who brought such joy to millions was living in a state of constant terror. Behind the scenes, MGM's publicity machine worked overtime to craft Gene Kelly's image as the ultimate masculine artist. They arranged photo opportunities with starlets, planted stories about his romantic conquests, and carefully managed every aspect of his public persona. But Gene knew that this protection came with a price: absolute loyalty to the studio system and complete submission to their control over his life and career. The golden cage was complete. Gene Kelly was now too famous to escape, too valuable to be allowed freedom, and too afraid of exposure to rebel against a very system that was slowly destroying his soul. Section 6. The Marriage Masquerade, Lies, and Desperate Performances. In 1941, Gene Kelly married Betsy Blair, a young actress with dreams of her own. To the world, they appeared to be the perfect Hollywood couple, talented, beautiful, and deeply in love. But behind closed doors, their marriage was built on a foundation of unspoken truths and carefully maintained illusions that would test both of their spirits to the breaking point. Betsy Blair was not naive. She had grown up in the theater world and understood the complexities of human nature better than most. When she married Gene, she may not have known the full extent of his secret, but she sensed the pain he carried and the battle he fought daily against his own nature. Their relationship became an elaborate dance of love, loyalty, and mutual protection that would define both of their lives for decades. The marriage served multiple purposes for Gene Kelly. It provided the ultimate cover for his secret, offering irrefutable proof of his heterosexuality to a world that was always watching. But more than that, it gave him a partner who understood the price of fame and the necessity of performance. Betsy became his co-conspirator, his protector, and perhaps the only person who truly saw the man behind the mask. Yet the strain of maintaining this elaborate charade took its toll on both of them. Gene's paranoia began to infect their relationship, making genuine intimacy nearly impossible. He analyzed every interaction with his wife for signs of suspicion or doubt. With public displays of affection that felt hollow and desperate. The man who could make audiences believe in love through his art struggled to experience it authentically in his own life. Betsy, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a marriage that was equal parts love story and tragedy. She genuinely cared for Gene, admired his talent, and wanted to protect him from the forces that threatened to destroy him. But she also had to surrender her own dreams and ambitions to serve as his shield against the world. The cost of being Mrs. Gene Kelly was the gradual erasure of Betsy Blair the individual. Their daughter, Kara's birth in 1942, added another layer to the performance. Gene threw himself into fatherhood with the same desperate intensity he brought to everything else, determined to prove that he could fulfill this most traditional of masculine roles. But even his love for his daughter was colored by the fear that his secret might somehow taint her future or destroy the family he had worked so hard to create. Section 7. The Revolutionary and His Rebellion. When art meets anguish, the 1940s and early 1950s marked Gene Kelly's most creative period, when he revolutionized dance on screen through classics like On the Town, An American in Paris, and Singing in the Rain. But what audiences saw as pure artistic inspiration was, in many ways, a man channeling his deepest pain into groundbreaking art. Every innovative dance sequence, every boundary-pushing routine, was both creative expression and emotional exorcism. Gene's choreographic genius was inextricably linked to his personal torment. The freedom he couldn't find in his private life exploded onto the screen in movements that defied convention and expectation. His dances were rebellious acts disguised as entertainment, subtle protests against the very society that forced him to live in hiding. When he danced through the streets in On the Town or splashed through puddles in Singing in the Rain, he was expressing a joy and freedom that existed nowhere else in his life. The creative process became Gene's only refuge from the suffocating demands of his public persona. In the rehearsal studio, working with other dancers and artists who understood the language of movement, he could momentarily drop his guard. Here, surrounded by people who valued artistic expression above social conformity, he found brief moments of authenticity. But even these sanctuaries were temporary, always shadowed by the knowledge that any misstep could expose him to ruin. His collaborations with directors like Vincente Minnelli and Stanley Donen were marked by an intensity that went beyond professional dedication. Gene poured every ounce of his suppressed emotions into these projects, demanding perfection not just from himself but from everyone around him. His reputation for being a demanding perfectionist was born not from mere artistic ambition, but from the desperate need to create something beautiful enough to justify the ugly compromises he made in his personal life. The irony was profound. Gene Kelly's secret shame was fueling the very art that would make him immortal. His pain was creating joy for millions. His private hell was generating public heaven. But the man himself was disappearing behind his own masterpieces, becoming more myth than human with each passing film. The revolutionary who was changing. cinema forever was simultaneously being destroyed by the very success of his revolution. Each triumph brought him closer to the edge of a breakdown that he could share with no one, not even those closest to him. Section 8. The Pressure Cooker. When success becomes suffocation by the early 1950s, Gene Kelly had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of and more. He was one of Hollywood's biggest stars, a revolutionary artist who had changed the very nature of musical cinema, and a cultural icon whose influence extended far beyond entertainment. But success, instead of bringing freedom, had only tightened the chains that bound him to his secret life. The higher Gene climbed in Hollywood's hierarchy, the more scrutinized his private life became. Gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons had made careers out of exposing the secrets of the stars, and Gene Kelly's squeaky clean image made him a particularly intriguing target. Every friendship was analyzed, every social interaction dissected for hidden meaning. The man who had once found solace in dance now found that even his professional relationships were viewed through the lens of suspicion. The pressure began to manifest in ways that terrified those closest to him. Gene developed obsessive behaviors, checking and rechecking locks on his home, screening phone calls multiple times, and maintaining elaborate mental lists of who had seen him where and when. His famous perfectionism in his work became a symptom of his larger need to control every aspect of his life, to leave nothing to chance that might expose his vulnerability. Sleep became elusive as his mind raced through endless scenarios of exposure and ruin. He would lie awake at night, replaying conversations and interactions, analyzing every word and gesture for potential misinterpretation. The exhaustion from these sleepless nights began to affect his work, requiring increasingly elaborate makeup and lighting techniques to hide the toll that his secret was taking on his physical appearance. His relationships with other men in the industry became strained and artificial. Gene found himself overcompensating in every interaction, ensuring that his behavior was beyond reproach but also increasingly distant and cold. Friendships that had once brought joy became sources of anxiety as he questioned the motives behind every invitation, every casual touch, every shared laugh. The man who had built his career on connection and collaboration was becoming increasingly isolated. The weight of maintaining his facade was crushing the very spirit that had made him a star in the first place. Gene Kelly was slowly suffocating under the pressure of his own success, and the worst part was that he had to do it with a smile on his face, pretending that everything was perfect in his perfect life. Section 9. The Breaking Point. When the mask begins to crack. The year 1957 marked a turning point in Gene Kelly's hidden struggle. The accumulated weight of years of deception, paranoia, and self-denial had pushed him to the edge of a complete psychological breakdown. What should have been the prime of his career instead became a period of private crisis that nearly destroyed everything he had worked to build. That catalyst came in the form of a young dancer who joined the cast of one of Gene's projects. The attraction Gene felt was immediate, undeniable, and absolutely terrifying. For the first time in decades, his carefully constructed defenses crumbled, and he found himself face to face with the truth he had spent his entire adult life trying to deny. The encounter lasted only moments, but its impact would reverberate through the rest of his life. In the days following this incident, Gene Kelly began to unravel. His famous discipline deserted him as he struggled to process emotions and desires that he had kept buried for so long. He missed rehearsals, forgot lines, and appeared on set in a state that alarmed his colleagues and friends. Those who worked with him noticed the change immediately. The spark in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a haunted look that no amount of makeup could disguise. Betsy Blair watched her husband's deterioration with growing alarm. She had always known that Gene carried deep pain, but she had never seen him this close to complete collapse. Their conversations became strained and careful, both of them dancing around truths that neither felt able to speak aloud. The silence that had once protected their marriage now threatened to destroy it as Gene retreated further into himself. The breaking point came during a late-night filming session when Gene simply stopped mid-dance and walked off the set without a word. He drove aimlessly through the Los Angeles streets until dawn, wrestling with thoughts of ending everything: his career, his marriage, his life. The man who had brought joy to millions sat alone in his car, contemplating whether the world would be better off without Gene Kelly and his terrible secret. It was perhaps the closest he ever came to choosing truth over survival, authenticity over artifice. But as the sun rose over Hollywood, Gene Kelly made the same choice he had been making for decades. He would continue the performance, no matter the cost to his soul. Section 10. The Art of Forgetting. Burying truth in motion. In the aftermath of his near breakdown, Gene Kelly developed what would become his most sophisticated survival strategy: the complete sublimation of his true self into his art. If he couldn't live authentically, he would pour every ounce of his suppressed humanity into his work, creating performances so powerful and moving that they would serve as monuments to the man he could never allow himself to be. This period saw some of Gene's most emotionally complex work, though audiences and critics would never understand the personal torment that fueled these performances. His dances became more abstract, more emotionally charged, filled with a kind of desperate beauty that spoke to something deeper than mere entertainment. He was literally dancing his pain away, using movement as a form of medication for wounds that could never fully heal. The creative process became increasingly ritualistic for Gene. He would arrive at the studio hours before anyone else, using the empty rehearsal rooms as a kind of confessional where he could express, through movement alone, all the emotions he could never voice. These private sessions were sacred to him, the only time when he felt truly free to be himself without consequence or judgment. His direction of other performers took on an almost therapeutic quality during this period. Gene began to see in young dancers and actors the same struggles he had faced, and he became fiercely protective of their vulnerability while helping them channel their own pain into art. He couldn't save himself, but perhaps he could save others from the same fate that had befallen him. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. Best Gene Kelly was becoming a better artist as he became a more tortured man. His suffering was feeding his creativity in ways that were both magnificent and heartbreaking. Each new project was both a masterpiece and a cry for help, a work of art and a suicide note written in dance steps and musical phrases. But the strategy had its limits. The more Gene buried himself in his work, the more disconnected he became from the people in his life. His family saw less of him, even when he was physically present, as his mind was constantly occupied with the elaborate choreography required to keep his secret hidden. The man was disappearing behind his own artistic genius, leaving only the performer to interact with the world. Section 11. The next generation's burden passing. Shadows to the children. As Gene Kelly aged, a new terror began to consume him, the fear that his secret might somehow infect or destroy the lives of his children. Carrie, born in 1942, and later his son Tim from his second marriage, represented both his greatest joy and his deepest anxiety. How could a man who had spent his entire life hiding from his own truth teach his children to live authentically? Gene's relationship with Carrie was particularly complex. As she grew into a young woman in the turbulent 1960s, she began to ask questions that terrified her father. Her generation was challenging all the old certainties, exploring identity and sexuality with a freedom that Gene had never known. Her innocence threatened to expose his guilt. Her openness highlighted his own imprisonment. The conversations between father and daughter became elaborate exercises in misdirection. When Carrie spoke about love, relationships, and the importance of being true to oneself, Gene found himself fighting the urge to confess everything, to warn her about the price of secrets, to share the wisdom he had gained from a lifetime of hiding, but the risk was too great. Even his own daughter could not be trusted with the truth that could destroy them all. Gene began to see his own struggles reflected in his children's faces, and it drove him to distraction. Every gesture, every preference, every friendship was analyzed for signs that his secret might have somehow been passed down to them. He became overprotective in ways that confused and frustrated his family, unable to explain that his fears were rooted not in normal parental concern but in the terror that his children might face. The same choice between authenticity and survival that had destroyed his own happiness. His second marriage to Jean Coyne in 1960 brought new hope, but also new complications. Tim's birth gave Gene another chance at fatherhood, but also another person to protect from the truth of who he really was. The cycle of deception and performance that had defined his relationship with Carrie now extended to his son, doubling the burden of maintaining his facade. The generational divide became a source of constant anguish. Gene Kelly, who had spent his career breaking barriers and pushing boundaries, found himself unable to break the most important barrier of all, the one that separated him from honest relationships with his own children. The man who had revolutionized art was trapped in the most conventional prison of all, the inability to be himself with the people he loved most. Section 12. The changing world. When society moves forward and leaves you behind. The 1960s and 1970s brought seismic shifts in American society that should have offered Gene Kelly hope for liberation. The civil rights movement, the feminist revolution, and the early stirrings of gay rights activism were challenging the very foundations of the conformity that had imprisoned him for decades. But instead of freedom, these changes brought Gene only deeper despair as he realized how much of his life he had wasted living in fear of judgments that were slowly losing their power. Watching the younger generation openly challenge sexual norms and gender roles, Gene Kelly felt the full weight of his own tragedy. Here were young people living with the authenticity he had never dared to claim, expressing themselves with a freedom he had spent his entire career denying himself. The revolution he had helped start in the arts was now being completed by others in the realm of personal liberation, and he was too old, too established, too afraid to join them. The irony was devastating. Gene Kelly, who had spent his career breaking down barriers between high and low art, between dance and film, between European sophistication and American energy, could not break down the barriers within his own life. He remained a prisoner of the very conventions he had challenged professionally, trapped by fears that were becoming increasingly outdated with each passing year, as society became more accepting of diversity in all its forms. Gene's secret began to feel less like a protection and more like a pointless sacrifice. The careers that would have been destroyed in the 1940s were flourishing in the 1970s. The lives that would have been ruined by exposure were being celebrated for their courage and authenticity. But Gene Kelly was too deep in his deception, too invested in his public image to risk the revelation that might have set him free. The changing world became a daily reminder of the life he might have lived. Every magazine article about sexual liberation, every news report about changing social attitudes, every conversation with younger colleagues who took their freedom for granted, served as evidence of how much he had lost to fear. The man who had helped America learn to dance was learning that he had never learned to truly live. This period marked the beginning of Gene's withdrawal from public life. Unable to adapt to a world that was moving beyond the need for his elaborate deceptions, he began to retreat into an increasingly isolated existence where the performance could continue undisturbed by the uncomfortable reality of social progress. Section 13. The final performances, when the show must go on. Gene Kelly's later years were marked by a series of what he privately called his final performances. Not his last films or stage appearances, but his last desperate attempts to maintain the facade that had defined his entire adult life. As his body aged and his energy waned, the effort required to sustain his public persona became increasingly exhausting. Yet he could not imagine any alternative to the performance that had become his prison. His appearances at award ceremonies and retrospectives during this period took on an almost tragic quality for those who knew him well. Here was a man being celebrated for bringing joy and authenticity to millions, while he himself had never known either in his personal life. The standing ovations and Lifetime Achievement Awards felt like mockeries of the authentic life he had never dared to live. Behind the scenes, Gene's health began to suffer from the stress of maintaining his deception for so many decades. The constant vigilance required to guard his secret had taken a physical toll that went far beyond normal aging. His doctors noted symptoms of chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. But Gene could never explain the true source of his suffering. Even in illness, the performance continued. His relationships with old friends and colleagues became increasingly strained as Gene struggled to maintain connections that had been built on partial truths and careful omissions. Many of his oldest friendships simply faded away, victims of his inability to lower his guard, even with those who had known him longest. The loneliness that had always lurked at the edges of his life now moved to the center, consuming more and more of his remaining years. The final cruel irony was that as Gene Kelly aged, his secret became simultaneously less dangerous and more burdensome. Society had changed enough that exposure might not have destroyed him professionally, but his own psychology had calcified around the deception to such a degree that revelation felt impossible. He was trapped, not by external forces, but by his own inability to imagine a life without the lies that had sustained him for so long. His last public performances were masterclasses in the art of deception, polished presentations of a man who had never truly existed except on stage and screen. The real Gene Kelly, whoever that might have been, had been so thoroughly buried under decades of performance that even he was no longer sure if that person still existed at all. Section 14. The weight of unspoken truth secrets that survive even death. As Gene Kelly entered his final years, the weight of his lifelong secret had transformed from a burden into something approaching a physical presence, a dark companion that shadowed every moment, colored every relationship, and poisoned every achievement. The man who had spent his career in motion found himself increasingly still, paralyzed by the accumulated weight of decades of deception. His marriage to Patricia Ward in 1990 represented one last attempt to convince the world, and perhaps himself, that the performance could continue even into old age. But those closest to the situation could see the desperation behind this union. The way Gene clung to the familiar patterns of his deception, even as his body and mind began to fail. The third act of his life had become indistinguishable from the performance that had consumed the first two. The most heartbreaking aspect of Gene's final years was the way his secret isolated him from the very people who might have provided comfort. In his declining health, he could not risk the vulnerability that comes with true intimacy, could not allow even his closest family members to see him without his carefully maintained mask. His hospital stays became exercises in performance art, with Gene maintaining his public persona even when he was fighting for his life. As reports of his deteriorating health became public, the outpouring of love and admiration from fans and colleagues around the world served as a constant reminder of the tragic irony of his situation. Here was a man who had brought authentic joy to millions while never experiencing it himself, who had taught the world to dance while remaining forever trapped in his own prison of deception. His final years were marked by moments of profound regret that he could share with no one. In lucid moments, Gene would contemplate the life he might have lived if he had found the courage to be authentic, the relationships he might have enjoyed if he had been willing to risk honesty. But these thoughts were too painful to pursue for long, and he would inevitably retreat back into the familiar comfort of his well-rehearsed lies. The secret that had haunted Gene Kelly for decades was now literally killing him. The stress and isolation taking their final toll on a body that had once defied gravity with grace. As his end approached, the man who had revolutionized dance found himself unable to move at all, trapped not just by physical frailty but by the psychological prison he had built around himself so many years ago. Section 15. The Grave's Final. Silent SWAT dies with the man. Gene Kelly passed away on February 2, 1996, taking with him to the grave the secret that had defined his life more powerfully than any of his artistic achievements. In his final moments, surrounded by family who loved him but had never truly known him, the performance that had sustained and destroyed him for 8 decades finally came to an end. But even in death, the secret lived on, encoded in the careful silences and deliberate omissions that would shape his legacy forever. The funeral was a celebration of Gene Kelly, the public figure, the revolutionary artist, the beloved entertainer, the man who had taught America to dance. Speaker after speaker praised his contributions to cinema, his dedication to his craft, his ability to bring joy to millions. But none could speak to the private torment that had driven so much of his creativity, the inner struggle that had given his art its desperate beauty and heartbreaking authenticity. In the months following his death, as biographers and journalists began to piece together the story of his life, they encountered the same carefully constructed walls that had protected Gene's secret for so long. Friends declined to comment on certain aspects of his personality. Family members redirected conversations away from uncomfortable topics. The machinery of deception that Gene had built continued to operate even after its creator was gone. The true tragedy of Gene Kelly's death was not just the loss of a great artist, but the realization that his greatest performance, the one that had required the most skill, demanded the most sacrifice, and extracted the highest price, would be buried with him. The man who had revolutionized the art of dance had also mastered the darker art of living a lie, so convincing that it had fooled even those who loved him most. Yet perhaps there is a kind of redemption in the fact that Gene Kelly's secret, whatever its true nature, fueled the creation of art that will outlive both the man and his deceptions. The films remain, the dances endure, and the joy he could never allow himself to experience genuinely continues to touch new generations of viewers who will never know the price that was paid for their entertainment. Conclusion. The dance that never ends. Gene Kelly's life stands as one of cinema's greatest triumphs and most profound tragedies, a testament to both the transformative power of art and the devastating cost of living in fear of one's own truth. The man who taught the world that there could be joy in the simplest puddle, music in the everyday street, and magic in ordinary movement, could never find these gifts in his own life. The secret that haunted Gene Kelly until his death reminds us that even our greatest heroes carry burdens we cannot imagine, that the performers who bring us the most joy may themselves be the most tormented, and that the price of perfection in public can be the complete destruction of authenticity in private. His story is a mirror in which we can examine our own capacity for both creation and self-destruction, our own struggles between who we are and who we think we must be to survive. Perhaps the ultimate irony is that Gene Kelly's greatest legacy may not be the films he made or the barriers he broke, but the questions his life raises about the cost of conformity and the price of secrets. In a world that is still learning to accept authenticity in all its forms, his story serves as both a warning and a call to courage, a reminder that the most revolutionary act may not be changing how we move, but changing how we live. The dance that Gene Kelly could never truly dance, the one where he moved to the rhythm of his own authentic self, remains forever unperformed. But in the space between his public artistry and his private anguish, we find a truth more powerful than any secret, that art can redeem even the most tormented life, and that sometimes the greatest performances are the ones that hide the deepest pain. What secrets do you carry? What dances